Hi, Cara. Can't hear. I can't.
How are you, Kelly?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
Hi, Pascal. I I think a lot of people are still muted.
Yes, we mute everybody when everyone comes in, so
Oh, you
there's
do?
no feedback. So no
Oh, okay.
worries, it's not your computer. But good to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you too.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Friday meeting. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and say hello, and we'll get started in just a minute.
I'm not quite sure how to do the chat.
Welcome, everybody. We're going to just take a couple more minutes here. We still have some folks trickling in.
Hi.
We had a meeting earlier this week on Zoom that started with a DJ, and now everything just feels quiet. So maybe we'll start integrating that into our Friday calls.
That's a great idea. I'll use that idea. Put a song in the beginning.
All right, everybody, we're going to get started today. Thank you all so much for joining us for our Friday update of week 9. We'll start off with Carl, who will start us off with a COVID-19 update where we are in numbers in terms of the state and what's happening with testing. We'll have an update from our public health department in a second as well. Carl, I'll send it off to you.
Great. Thanks, Pascal. And hi, everybody. It's good to see everyone today. I know it's the Friday before a long weekend and it's 80 degrees out, but we still have over 100 people in the room. So I know folks are probably ready to talk about state guidelines. Everyone's grappling with what came out this week, including us, and we'll get into that in a minute. I just want to start with our public health overview. As of May 22nd, there are 12,239 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Boston residents. That number of active cases is continuing its downward trend. And as Pascal mentioned, we're going to hear more in a moment from Leslie Carnes from the Health Commission to give us an update on the testing that the city of Boston did, the antibody and COVID-19 testing. I want to emphasize before we get to that a couple of points in particular from the mayor's press conferences this week. The first is that the Safer at Home statewide advisory is in effect. This is essentially a revision of the stay-at-home order that takes phase 1 of reopening into account. So you can still visit essential businesses and you can partake in the phase 1 reopenings like retail, curbside pickup. And to double down on something that the mayor has mentioned a couple of times in his remarks, just because something is allowed to reopen doesn't mean that it has to, or that you should feel like you have to take advantage of it. I think as we've been monitoring how the businesses that are allowed to reopen right now are thinking about it, not everyone is rushing into things. Not everybody has the ability to follow all of the guidelines that have been released by the state. So we're not seeing like the flip of a switch here where suddenly every hair salon is open in the city of Boston. This is still going to take time, and everyone is still trying to respond to the guidelines and figure out how to make that work for their business or for their organization. The mayor's also emphasized residents should continue physical distancing, hand washing, wearing face coverings. All of that is still in effect. And the second point that I want to share is around PPE. As offices and places of employment reopen, we know that businesses and organizations need to provide PPE to their employees. So to help with this, the city launched a new website to centralize industry-specific cleaning and PPE guidelines, as well as a list of vendors where you can procure PPE. So this will continue to update as the state guidelines update and as we go through these phases. But I want to share the link with folks now in case you're having a hard time procuring that. And it says small businesses at the top, but it's for anybody who needs to procure that for their office, for their employees, or for whomever. So with that said, I want to turn it over to Leslie Carnes to give us an update on that antibody and COVID-19 testing. Leslie?
Great, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to talk to everybody. And thank you for everyone to taking the time to listen to this presentation on such a beautiful day. As all of you may already be aware, Massachusetts General Hospital and the Boston Public Health Commission conducted a study to evaluate a community exposure of COVID-19. This study collected samples from residents and performed a PCR test and an antibody test. I want to make sure everyone understands a PCR test is used to diagnose if someone is infected with COVID-19, and a positive antibody test will indicate if your body developed antibodies against the virus, probably from a past infection. So in this particular study, more than 5,000 residents living in East Boston, Rossendale, and Dorchester specific within the boundaries of the zip codes 02121 and 02125 were invited to voluntarily participate in the study, with the total outreach representing more than 55% being people of color. Approximately 1,000 residents expressed interest in participating, and 786 residents were deemed eligible. And now, just to make sure everyone understands, residents with symptoms of previous positive COVID-19 tests were disqualified from the study. So out of those, 750 residents enrolled in the study and received the required testing. The results from the study indicated that 9.9% of those tested positive for antibodies and 2.6% of asymptomatic individuals tested positive for COVID-19. So approximately 1 in 10 residents in this study had developed antibodies, and approximately 1 out of 40 tested positive for COVID-19 while they had no symptoms. Now, if we looked at the information broken down by demographics, out of the 750 participants, the median age was 42.4 years old. 61.6% were female, about 38.3% were male, 36.8% were from Rossendale, 25.1% were from East Boston, 23.2% were from the zip code 02125 in Dorchester, and 14.9% were from the zip code 02121 in Dorchester. 62% were white, 18.7% were Black or African American, 12% were Latino or Hispanic, 2.3% were Asian or Pacific Islander, 0.13% were American Indian or Alaska Native, and 1.6% prefer not to say. And out of those, 1.6% were unknown. So for whatever reason, we weren't able to collect that demographic information. So again, if we break down the information by neighborhoods, in East Boston, 1.1% of those tested positive for COVID-19. So that means that at the time, even though they had no symptoms, they actually were carrying COVID-19 and they were potentially infectious. 13.3% tested positive for antibodies, which again, meaning that they had been exposed to COVID-19 and that their body had created antibodies. So in Rossendale, 2.2% tested positive for COVID-19 and 7.6% tested positive for the antibodies. And again, in Dorchester, breaking it down by the two different zip codes, in 02121, 2.7% tested positive for COVID-19, while 6.3% tested positive for antibodies. And in the zip code 02125, 4.6% tested positive for COVID-19 and 12.1% tested positive for antibodies. So I know I threw a lot of numbers at you, and I just want to make sure that everyone understands that at this time, antibody testing can show us who has previously been exposed to the virus. We do not know if a positive antibody means that the person has developed immunity. And if it does develop, if the person did develop immunity, if it's adequate to protect against further infection or for how long that immunity could last. The study tests a point in time. So this is obviously rapidly changing landscape, and results are only suggestive of what was going on during the 2-week period that the tests were taken. This was a pilot study of only 750 people. And though we are tempted to extrapolate to other neighborhoods in Boston, it's still a really small sample. Though the focus was on finding the level of pathogen in the population, the findings that 1 in 40 asymptomatic residents tested positive for COVID-19 reminds all of us the importance of continued vigilance to prevent the disease. Antibody testing, again, is not widespread for many reasons. One reason is that the current main value is at the population level. Individual results cannot be utilized to shape individual behavior or treatment. There are many antibody tests out there that are being promoted and sold. Some of these tests are reliable, but a number of them have not been shown to be reliable. Until and unless an antibody test has been validated and verified using standard laboratory procedures, it should not be trusted to give an accurate results. And this applies to tests done in laboratory and those done in the field. It also, it's important to know that it takes 2 weeks after exposure to the virus and infection for antibody tests to start to become positive. I know this question comes up a lot. More testing will be coming. The city of Boston is trying to identify a plan of how to move forward to obtain a better understanding of COVID-19 presence in our community. So with that said, again, I just want to echo what was said in the beginning. It's still very important for us to continue practice social distancing as much as possible, hand washing, and using face coverings when we're out to help spread to help slow down the spread of this disease. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for the update. All right, we're going to move on to Emily for an update from the state in terms of the reopening and what are the phases like. Emily, it's on you.
Thanks, Pascal. And just to be clear, I am not the state. I merely look and make sure I'm looking at the material and try to interpret it and report on it. So, as you know, gosh, it feels like last week. So this past Monday, the Reopening Advisory Board released their reopening plan for Massachusetts. As we expected, it's a phased plan with 4 phases. Starting on May 18th, phase 1 officially began, which is called START. The way that these phases are going to work, and this slide kind of tells you that each one is a minimum of 3 weeks long, but they have been real clear that those phases could be longer. It's all driven, the circuit breakers that allow for the next phase to start are driven by the data collection. And we assume that's going to be around public health data trends, including number of ICU beds that are occupied, the number of cases, COVID-19 active cases, and the number of deaths. The other thing that the governor and the Reopening Advisory Board made very clear is that there is the possibility that we will go back a phase. So it's not just because we've passed through phase 1 doesn't mean we won't return to phase 1 at some point if things do not continue to trend in a positive direction. So, if we could go, and I think as expected, right? In phase 1, it's very cautious. There's limited industries that are able to resume operations. There's a real push for continuing social distancing, and the industries that are able to really take that on and allow for social distancing to happen are being reopened quicker. If we could move to the next slide. Thank you. I want to credit BUR's The Artery with breaking this down in a really handy little fashion. So you can see what's included in each phase. And these are obviously sort of a more inclusive definition of arts and culture than I think folks normally consider, but I think it's really useful to think about this all at once. What I want to just sort of bring our largest point to is that as Kara said, just because you can open doesn't mean you have to open, or perhaps this is editorializing, should open. And the other piece is that the majority of our cultural activity subsectors aren't going to be open until phase 3 and phase 4. And when those phases happen, which if we are super lucky, we're looking towards the end of June and beginning July for those phases, that doesn't mean our audiences are necessarily going to return and that people are going to feel safe in public spaces right away. So what does that mean in terms of, sorry, before I move on to that, I want to say this. It's also really clear that, and forgive the cliche, I used it this morning, they are building the plane as they're flying it. So there was more detailed guidance for industries and sectors that are opening in phase 1 that was released on May 18th. We already know that a group has been stood up, that's the restaurant, hotel, and tourism or cultural sites working group that's looking at guidance for phase 2. And what we expect is, this is a hunch on my part, but what we expect is that there will be working groups that will address the other industries and subsectors that will be open in phase 3 and phase 4. So just because there hasn't been clear guidance yet doesn't mean it's not necessarily coming. I want to be clear, that doesn't mean we don't have to push for that and really encourage and be participants in saying we know, we can look at what the Department of Health is recommending and extrapolate how we as professional gatherers of people can think about that in our specific venues and our specific disciplines. So that's the other piece that I just want to talk about too, in terms of how we're seeing this plan roll out. So because the majority of our industry isn't really going to be able to open until phase 3 and phase 4, and we don't know our audiences and our community's general appetite around this, the need to advocate for federal, state, and local support to help us through this period is still front of mind. And so while we are obviously very focused on reopening and making sure that the creative community has a voice in that reopening, my dog Babe has just joined me in the office, forgive me. We are also really continuing to keep our eye and our focus on how do we make sure that the creative community is included in relief plans, that we have access to pots of money that are inclusive for small business organizations, and that we're following other pieces of legislation that are very meaningful for us to get us through this period. So Cara, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, a couple things that are coming up in the chat also. And I do want to emphasize again that Emily and I are interpreting and communicating state guidelines. So we can't speak to the intention behind these right now, which is, I think, part of the kind of struggle that we're all feeling as we're trying to figure out how to take this and operationalize it and what else we can say about it. There isn't a definition of small, medium, or large. I don't know when we'll actually get that from the state. It might not be until right before that phase. And then another question about the limitation on gatherings. Phase 1 continues the limitation of 10 people, and everything after that is, I think, marked as TBD. So, how they're going to make those determinations, what counts as large or not large, these are all things that we need to filter back up to the state as major questions that need to be addressed as soon as possible. Gary has a question for Emily. Any insights on the desire to extend PPP loan period from 8 weeks to as much as 16 to 24 weeks?
Yeah, so yes, Gary. So a group of over 70 national arts and cultural organizations signed on to 25 recommendations to help the arts and cultural community through the COVID-19 crisis. These are broken up into sort of 3 umbrella ask groupings, including how to continue to provide support and capacity to the creative sector, how to allow creative work to continue even in this moment, and then how to keep our people, both our artists, our staff, and our audiences safe. And these are actually federal recommendations. One of the recommendations is to extend the PPP program, replenish the program, as well as the EIDL program. So we know that last week the HEROES Act was passed out of the House. It was also made real clear by the Senate Majority Leader McConnell and the White House that that was a no-go bill. But apparently there are parts of that bill that have bipartisan support. So the 4th stimulus bill is still being drafted. And so we're working with our national partners, as I'm sure you all are, to advocate and push that the creative community find relief in that 4th bill. The other, yeah, okay. I think that's my answer.
Great. So I think what we'll do is go to the next slide, and as people continue to have questions, ask them. We're going to run through this next piece and then open it up for Q&A, I think, pretty quickly after that. Oh, looks like we have a line on one of our columns here. It's interesting. So Pascal did some amazing work just going through all of the comments and questions from last Friday's call and putting them into these categories to help us understand kind of how many questions are coming from which areas of concern. And so I just wanted to walk through these and talk a little bit about how we're moving forward in each one of these areas. And I hope that we can continue to do this and really intentionally track all of the questions that we're receiving so that we can tell you from the city side what is moving forward where. So thank you, Pascal, for doing that as well. So to start with, summer and outdoor events and gathering and how, which is a great title for many, many questions we're having right now. So the phase 1 still has that limitation on gatherings, but at the same time, we're seeing some initiatives happen from the city and also some questions coming up about what's allowable. We're going to have open streets in some ways to help restaurants. What does that mean for other kinds of interventions? We've been in conversation and had really good conversations with the streets team. We've been in conversation this week with the special event permitting folks at the city to start to talk about how to take advantage of any new open spaces or existing open spaces and what the approval process is going to be for those events on city property. We do need help here coming up with some scenarios to test. There's a little bit of, we don't know how to approve kind of creative solutions that we don't know exist yet. So this is an ask to folks on the call. If there's any specific event that you are actually looking to get approved or that you're interested in developing, please let us know, and I'll ask I will ask Pascal to put her email address in the chat. We're really interested in workshopping some specific concepts that we can bring back to the permitting folks and to parks to help advocate for moving those forward and having some kind of clear process for what is allowable or what is required. Do you need to submit kind of a public health form in addition to your event application, and what does that look like? We're also drafting some guidelines for public art projects to move forward, starting with murals that are just done by one person. So those are going to start to move ahead, and we've been in conversation with some public art friends and advocates about what that can start to look like. Lots of questions there still around what does it look like if you have a crew or you're working with young people. That starts to get into some of these other questions. Support from the city. This topic had a variety of questions about funding, technical assistance, equity. What is the city going to be doing to respond to these guidelines? We're in the process of assessing where and how we can shift our FY21 programs in the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture to provide direct financial relief or technical assistance to the sector, in addition to some other pieces like research and advocacy. We're hoping to receive the maximum amount of CARES Act funding through the NEA, which we will hear back about by early July. That funding is specifically for re-granting to organizations. On the technical assistance front, the city has an RFP out now for a public health consultant to advise the city and the industry specific groups, of which arts and culture is one. And we're looking for opportunities to bring public health guidance to this group even sooner than that, and possibly have some discipline specific conversations. I think going back to phase 4 and kind of large organizations, the theaters, performing arts, in large spaces, there's still a lot of technical questions there that need to be addressed. And so we're seeing how much of that we can do now through this technical assistance RFP that the city has out. Lastly, we were in the process pre-COVID of engaging a consultant to help us with conversations about equity in the arts and culture sector in Boston. So we're in the process of adjusting that scope of work now, including reaching out to some of you for interviews about how those conversations can be responsive to the moment that we're in. This is still very much in early stages, but we are definitely committed to supporting this and to supporting kind of just dialogue around this question of how do we come back better and more equitable and not just repeat the same inequities in the sector. So in this moment of shifting our policies and our operations, how are we reimagining how we do this work with each other collectively? So I hope to provide some updates about that, maybe not in the next couple of weeks, but as we get going, we'll keep reporting out about it, and there should be opportunities to plug into that conversation. If you have burning thoughts about that, of course, you can feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to give background on that project as well. In youth engagement, especially youth engagement in person over the summer, this continues to be a really tricky conversation. I think in the state guidelines, there's actually a whole slide that talks about how there will be more guidance on summer camps and other kinds of in-person youth activities that will be coming, TBD. We're having this conversation with a lot of other departments, BCYF, Economic Development, the Mayor's Office, BPS, of course, the Success Links Jobs Program, and others. So there's a lot of interdependencies here where we absolutely need to follow public health guidance. So as we find out more about how those programs are moving forward, or if we hear more from the state, we'll obviously include that in this update. We're receiving some really specific questions for discipline-specific information, or for specific types of arts-related businesses. Pascal has been working to compile some existing guidelines, including some discipline-specific work that the national service organizations are doing a really good job of providing. We're also getting plans from other city and state arts offices to compare notes, especially with places that are farther along in their reopening process, and what are some of the growing pains or kind of lessons learned from that. I will say from my initial conversations with other cities, we're all kind of in a similar boat. We're all trying to figure out how to adapt these state guidelines and finding areas where there isn't information that's specific to arts and culture, or where arts and cultural uses might do something different with that information and they need more public health guidance in order to figure out how they plug in. I do want to emphasize that this work is really about pulling together information as much as we can ahead of time, before the phase and before the state guidelines, so that we can foresee where these gaps in information are going to be, and we can get ahead of it as much as possible. So just taking phase 1, for example, we received the guidelines a week before they went into effect or go into effect on Monday. That's not much time to do real planning, but we did already see in that week where there were some questions. So for houses of worship, for example, there was no information about choirs singing during services or events happening. We know a lot of folks have events in houses of worship. So we are giving that feedback back to the state that needs to be addressed. And if events are not going to be allowable, then that needs to be clear, and that there are specific public health considerations around singing and around choruses and choirs that need to be taken into account. And going to the next column, communications. We've talked a lot about this in these meetings, and the city has definitely heard from every industry group and every conversation that there's a desire for the city to play a role in communicating how organizations, companies, employers are adhering to the guidelines. So that's definitely been heard. For us, that includes communicating to your audiences and to the public. So this is an ongoing conversation, but it's definitely registered for the city and for the mayor's office. We're also working on a vehicle for communicating feedback to the state. And actually, Emily has a survey that she's gonna, or a form that she's gonna share in a second about how to do that. And that's helpful for us because the more that we collect about what your specific questions or concerns are, the more we understand where there's gaps in information and either, you know, where the city needs to play more of a role or where we really need to give feedback back to the state. We received some questions on venues and facilities. We are commissioning kind of a quick and dirty update to our performing arts facility assessment from 2017. So this is going to help us understand what different facilities need in order to reopen and where our vulnerabilities are from a space perspective. And parallel to that, I'm in conversation with other municipalities that have found ways to pay for equipment or facilities upgrades and costs through stimulus funding. So trying to find creative ways that funding has been made available to the arts sector and trying to see what we can replicate here in Boston. And then the last thing, and this is, I'm sorry, I'm throwing so much information. The last thing is engaging audiences in innovative ways. We've heard a lot from people saying, you know, we really need to engage the public. We need to be visible. Also, we need to foster connection and find creative ways to be together right now. And then also folks saying, yeah, we need to do that. And also that does increase consumer confidence. That increases the likelihood that people will come back to the arts and come back to venues and performances and gatherings in phase 3 and phase 4 and beyond. So I think to this one, and it kind of goes back to working on and workshopping scenarios for outdoor events, you know, show us what you're working with. I know this is a time where a lot of people are thinking about getting creative, and some of the ideas that we have are everything from, or that we've heard, I should say, are everything from what does curbside pickup look like for art? Can we do performances in a parking lot? You know, moving around parked cars that have people in them, kind of like a drive-in movie theater, but for dance or for other kinds of performance. We had a question about open streets and parks that was about, you know, if 8 people walk at the same pace, maintaining physical distancing while playing string instruments, is that an event or can they just do that? Does that follow public health guidelines? And for some of these things, there's nothing really stopping you from doing this now. But we know that people are worried that they're not going to be doing it safely or that they need some sort of approval. So the bottom line here is bring us your ideas. The more concrete they are, the better, so that we can really test them with permitting and with the mayor's office. And in the case of something that already seems allowable, where you're being smart about PPE, about physical distancing, you might not need our permission to do that. Like the curbside pickup for art, that's not an event, that doesn't necessarily require city permitting. That's just you following the state retail guidelines for phase 1. And then lastly, in terms of consumer confidence, there are 2 audience surveys underway. I think we've covered those before. The city will be briefed on these, and there is already a conversation about connecting the results to communications campaigns, either outside of the city or in partnership with the city's communications, going back to this question of how do we help employers and organizations and businesses communicate that they are following public health protocols. So we'll continue to track these. I think this just goes back to, you know, the more questions and concerns that you can send our way, the more that we can try to be responsive. I hope this feels like we are being responsive and we are following these different threads and trying to make sure that we're finding places where there are interdependencies or crosswalking with different departments to make sure that we're getting these things answered for the arts and culture sector specifically. And I see that there are some questions. Emily, do you have anything to add to any of these? Are you seeing anything?
I there's one. So Alexandra writes about the guidelines are too late, and you know, as a mother of a 3-year-old, I certainly hear you. And I think that the problem is that the reality we are living in is that they're trying to figure this out as they go, and that they are really, as much as possible, attempting to do this based on the data they are getting in real time around reopenings, as well as what's safe to do. So I certainly, I hear you, and I think that this is something that we are going to have to figure out how, as a sector, to be nimble and adaptive and pivot. But that doesn't make it easy, and I want to just acknowledge that, because none of these pieces are easy.
Yeah, that and we feel the pain and frustration on that one for sure. And I think the city's been really trying to push forward with the youth jobs program, and there's still a lot of questions. You know, that program starts in early July, I believe, and you know, we don't know if we're going to have the state guidelines around youth summer camps and other things to really be able to inform that. So it is incredibly difficult to plan anything for anyone around any of these phases. Ron says, could the support from the city category be expanded to include support from the private sector? Yeah, that's a really great point. And we should definitely make room for that on this slide. I appreciate that comment. Boston Singers Resource released some guidance for individual gig singers on returning to work in houses of worship. That's super interesting. Margaret, I don't know if you want to just hop on and say something about that really quickly, or if we should just follow this link.
Feel free to take a look at the link. We just wanted to put something out to help singers advocate for themselves. I think we can't take for granted that people organizing services are familiar with the science, but at the same time, I know singers are eager to get back to work, and I think there are ways that it can be done safely, but we want to make sure that it is done safely. So we just felt really strongly that giving singers a framework to ask questions and educate perhaps their employers would be something really helpful. And we also wanted to discourage the idea that singing, we don't want singing to become the thing that is the most dangerous now and forever. So the more we can encourage it being done safely, I think the better that will be for long-term consumer confidence in this sector. So thank you, Kara.
Great, thanks so much for sharing that. That's super useful, and we'll integrate that into the materials that we're collecting as well. Jen Fox says, since the city is looking at ways to expand the use of roads, sidewalks, parking lots, etc., will there be new or outdoor space for performing arts opportunities, not only this summer, but into the fall? I think the short answer there is yes. And it's just a matter of figuring out what the protocol is for doing that. And I think, again, are there things that can be done that don't venture into city event territory, where people can just be smart about how they're designing that in a way to avoid congregating and gathering and all of that? Probably. One of the conversations that we've had with the streets team was about the Open Streets program that was just announced this week. They're going to be trying to shut down some mostly residential streets to pedestrians. Could you do something there as a performance? I don't really see why not. And it's just figuring out how are you actually going to operationalize that so that you're not having a crew of people gathering. But if everyone is doing what they're supposed to do and they're continuing to walk, and performers are solo or distance from one another, it seems very possible that those would be new spaces for performance and interaction. Katie says, should we be expecting additional guidelines or mandates from the city after the state releases their guidelines for the subsequent phases? That's a good question, Katie. I think we're not sure right now if our technical assistance that we're hoping to provide really serves the purpose of operationalizing the state public health guidelines for the city, or whether there's something more that's really needed there. I think it's been acknowledged over and over again internally and in our presentation last Friday that arts and culture needs, as a sector, needs additional support. It's just a matter of figuring out what that really looks like. And I don't know that it's clear that an additional set of guidelines is exactly the thing that's needed for everyone, or if there are, like with public art, you know, there's an easy way to do a couple of pages that help you navigate what a public art installation could look like given the state guidelines. So I think we're still trying to figure out what the best delivery is for any additional pieces of information. What else here? Yes, we're in touch with Urban Mechanics. We got a question about 2020 events at the Heinz Convention Center. I don't have a good answer for you on that right now, but we will look into it. And then Erica is sharing a link about reopening from a safety and liability perspective. Yeah, liability, I mean, it would be interesting to hear if others have been seeing resources on liability. I think this is something we haven't talked enough about yet. And all of our conversations up until now have really been about the audience side and the kind of performance side, and yeah, from an audience perspective and a reopening perspective, and not so much on the employee side. And how are you making sure that you're also protecting employees who are going to be in close proximity to one another or having to rehearse or perform. So that's another thing that we're hearing a lot about now. Looking ahead to fall and beyond, is there a resource that can be compiled of spaces available for rehearsals and performances? Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm hoping that the update to the Performing Arts Facility Study that we're going to do will help us think about what we need to provide here, particularly as some venues are going to remain closed or maybe closed for parts of the season. We already know that there is a huge crunch, obviously, on small performance and rehearsal spaces. And as larger institutions, higher ed, close their spaces and take them offline and they're not available anymore, that winds up having kind of a trickle-down effect impacting lots of organizations, whether it's part of their season or their entire season, because that was their main venue. So we're hoping that that gets surfaced in the study, which we should know more about by mid-June. So I think I will pause there and we can go to the next slide. And this is really just an example. This is an outline of a table of contents. It's table of contents from Connecticut's Art and Culture Industry Guidelines for Operating During COVID-19. So as we've been looking at other states and cities and just seeing what they've put together, I wanted to share this as like a pretty clear and concise example of what other places are doing. And I think, you know, if we went back to the slide that Emily started with, there is this in fine print, you know, industry-specific groups will be convened prior to the phase in which they're going to reopen. So presumably there's an opportunity for the arts sector to influence the state's guidelines around this. And that's really why we want to look at things like this and say, what's missing? What's good about this? Does it feel like this actually covers the territory that needs to be covered? Or are there pieces that really don't speak to what we're hearing and where we're seeing a lot of concern? So I just wanted to share this as an example. Go to the next slide. Back to you, Emily.
Great, thanks, Cara. And the other piece about that work is that we, you know, many of you signed on to a letter a couple weeks ago urging the administration to include representatives from the creative and cultural community on the reopening advisory board. We weren't able to get someone on that reopening advisory board, but that doesn't mean that we haven't continued to press the point and both encourage and share information that we are learning with members of the staff of the Economic Development the Office of Economic Development and members of that reopening advisory board. The Lieutenant Governor and Secretary Keneally stood up a working group. Did I mention this already? The working group about restaurants, hotels, and tourism? A little bit, yeah. So this group is about 17 people. It does not have any representation from the creative community yet again. It's something that we flagged. It's something that we have worked with. We looked through the list of who was included. I can work on getting a copy of that list. I think there's a Boston Business Journal article that actually has the full list of people. But we've started doing some connecting points with members of that working group to say, can you please share our concern that there's no representatives from a cultural cultural tourism perspective on this group that's potentially putting together guidelines. So in the efforts to try and think through what our questions are going to be and to support the work that Cara and other municipal leaders are doing, MassCreative has stood up. Yes, Kelly, no, the MCC is not included on that governor's working group. We had a call this morning, the Mass Cultural Council, with some members of the legislature to address this point. So again, we are working at a lot of different levels and a lot of different touch points to talk about this and to advocate. So part of what we're interested in working in coalition to do is to get these questions, to share them with municipal leaders like Cara, to share them with the Mass Cultural Council, so that we can think about what's the technical assistance that we might need to stand up, not we being Emily Reddick or the Mass Cultural Council, not we being MassCreative, but we as a sector need to stand up to help make sure that we are taking care of our audiences, our communities, and our artists and staff correctly. So if the link will be included in the PowerPoint deck that'll be sent out. It's real quick. It basically says, what are your questions about phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4? What are your additional questions? And then there's a real quick, some just quick demographic information around geography, and then your email address, so that if we can connect you with some technical assistance, we will do everything we can in our power to connect you with that technical assistance. But please, the sort of focus of this is really about shaping our advocacy work. So if you do have specific technical questions, forgive me, Pascal, I'm going to suggest that you really share those with Pascal too, because I think she'll be a great person to connect you with resources. So Eve asks, can we share the link to the Connecticut guidelines? I got those guidelines from a counterpart in Connecticut in a PDF, but let me see what I can do. Eve?
I just posted the link in the chat.
Look at Cara, you beat me to it. Awesome. So there are the guidelines. There are a number of other states that have done this, where they have actually engaged the creative community to help take the Department of Public Health recommendations and mandates and allow the creative community to practically apply that to their work and their sectors. And so I have not given up hope that we will not be tapped to do that as a sector, but we are not going to stop and wait for the invitation. And that's something that I'm hoping we can all work on together. Can we move on to the next slide? Okay, so as I mentioned before, when we're looking at this reopening plan, it really became very quickly apparent that our sector is going to need a lot of help and safety nets to get us through this. One of the things that I talk about is that our creative ecology is made up of a lot of people and a lot of organizations, and that all of that is important in terms of serving our communities, delivering the moments of connection and well-being that we so much care about, and frankly, being an economic engine of the Commonwealth. And if the Commonwealth does want to recover in full, then taking care of this muscle of that, of our larger economic ecology is incredibly important to do now and not wait until it's too late. So right now, the bulk of ability to provide safety nets and assistance is in the hands of the federal government. The state is waiting to see what the feds are going to do. Municipalities are waiting to see what the state is going to do. We do have a very supportive congressional delegation, that includes all the members of the Senate, both of our senators and all the members of Congress from the state of Massachusetts. But that doesn't mean they don't need to hear from you and hear specifically about your true desire to see larger support for the creative community. And that's not just about more dollars to the NEA, the NEH, and IMLS. All of us are dealing with issues having to do with employment, as employers and as individuals. All of us are looking to small business assistance programs and loan programs, and there are ways that Congress can help amplify that message. So we've stood up we've connected and linked to 2 actions we'd ask you to take around this issue that's really important to do right now. So the first one is emailing your member of Congress. Congress. There's a link in here that'll pass you through to the Americans for the Arts that has put together a rather comprehensive ask to all members of Congress, and that's both your senators and your representatives, that includes asks to the NEA, the NEH, and IMLS, but goes beyond that. There's also, from time to time, the need to actually call your member of Congress's office. And so we've provided a link to some materials to support making those calls. Included, you'll find a link to look up the number for your member of Congress, as well as a script that you can use to tell your story and to share what you're hoping that your representative will do in terms of supporting the creative community and cultural community through this period of time. You know, I think, again, it's really important that we not assume that because they have been arts and cultural champions in the past that they will continue to be. They have a lot of competing priorities right now and are hearing from a lot of people, and we want to make sure that our voices are included in that as well. Thank you, Cara, for giving me a little bit of time to make that advocacy ask today. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ping me about that.
Great, thanks, Emily. And I think that if we go to the next slide.
Oh yeah, hey, there's also some stuff happening on the state level, whatever. So just real quick, these are things that we've talked about in the past that I just want to give you a quick update on. So that the issue that nonprofit employers found themselves in, where they were self-insured and now have to pay very large amounts back to the state unemployment trust fund. Well, here's a little bit of, not the best news, I'd say it's medium good news. The Senate passed a bill that would include a 120-day delay on repayment to that trust fund. It got passed yesterday. The expectation is that it'll be on Baker's desk either today or early next week to be signed. As soon as it's signed, that delay goes into effect. What that does is it gives us more time as advocates and a coalition of folks, including the medical professions, the YMCAs, the Boys and Girls Clubs, to advocate for 100% forgiveness from the state. Right now, you have 50% forgiveness thanks to the federal government, but we are continuing to push for advocacy of 100% forgiveness. The other piece is I think I mentioned this a long time ago, is that Senator Eldridge sponsored a bill that would make COVID-19 a qualified claim under business interruption insurance. There were 45 co-sponsors, both from the Senate and the House on that bill, which is good. It had a hearing yesterday with the Joint Committee on Financial Services. So just a little update, it's continuing to move forward and we continue to follow it. Next slide. And I'm pretty sure this is my last slide. Yep. Here's my weekly reminder that the Health Connector has extended their enrollment period now through May 25th. Again, we're in a moment where folks' income is shifting drastically and access to health insurance is more important than ever. So if you or someone you know in your network is concerned about this, please click that link and find out. And then here's a new one to add to the weekly reminders. The 2020 census is happening right now. And for many reasons, including access to federal resources and aid, adequately drawing up districts for elections, the census is an incredibly important piece of the government's work and our work as individuals and as residents of the Commonwealth. So please take the census. Right now, the city of Boston is fairly underrepresented in census takers. And so it's really important that we not only take the census, but we encourage our networks to take the census as well. So there's a link that will take you directly to the census. I did the census in March. It was the greatest 5-minute palate cleanser of my day that day. So please do take it. All right, now I promise I'm done.
Great, thank you, Emily. So I think actually we can just go to Q&A, and Christina, that might be the very last slide. If folks still have questions, I mean, obviously everyone still has a lot of questions, but if there are questions for right now that you want to get out on the table, if you want to raise your hand to speak for a moment, please do. Catherine Peterson, Emily and her MassCreative colleagues do an excellent 15-minute advocacy update, 9:45 a.m. every Friday morning. Yes. you can get your advocacy update from Emily in the morning and then join this 3 p.m. call. Bookend your day. But yes, it's great. Any other questions or thoughts? And I think while we're waiting, thanks Pascal, link to the census. We really are just focusing our time right now on being responsive to questions that come in and lifting them up. And I would say also on compiling this kind of master set of guidelines. As we mentioned before, the art service organizations in Boston and Greater Boston have also been really helpful in sending us things that they think are good and worth replicating. And this is something that we can share back as we do a little bit more analysis, particularly for that phase 4 performing arts time. And then in the interim, really thinking about how we can approve things happening in outdoor space and get departments on the same page for that. Any other thoughts? Yes, John, you should be unmuted. Looks like John has his hand raised, but isn't.
How about now?
There we go. Okay.
Okay. Since most nonprofits in the arts of all sizes, they're one of the number one goals, one of the number one needs is money. And since the city doesn't really have any extra money to dole out, I think we need to have a way to have a big fundraiser for nonprofit arts organizations. I don't know if the city can take on that responsibility or just be sort of like a background assistance in terms of organizing, helping to some of the logistics of that, because there would have to be probably a virtual kind of an event of some type. But I'd imagine we could raise a lot of money that could be shared with a lot of nonprofits at this point. That's just my thought. I know that the Main Street model, I think they canceled their big fundraiser this year, but they normally have a big fundraiser and they raise hundreds of thousands of dollars that they then distribute to 20 main streets around the city. Now, there's a lot more than 20 nonprofit arts organizations, I realize, but so maybe they're not all interested either, because to get money, you have to participate in the fundraising event somehow, whatever that event is. Is there anything the city can do short of in that regard, Kara?
Yeah, it's a great question. We've had a few people reach out trying to see, is there kind of a one big fundraiser to help with this? I think the answer is that, like with the City Resilience Fund, there is the ability to help think about fundraising and what a platform for that is. I think the strategy around that is really challenging, and we would have to be piecing together a few different things, both fundraising, just generally looking to philanthropy, and if there's a way for folks to match funds that are raised or funds from the city, as well as I think the most untapped resource right now is other areas of funding that are not arts related, and how to make sure that the arts sector is showing up and getting those funding sources that are coming from stimulus bill or other places where we don't normally show up. And those areas, it's not like, we're all with this huge deficit and loss of revenue. Like, every sector is trying to figure out how to help fill that hole, and there isn't enough funding to fill that hole collectively. But how can the arts show up in some of these areas where we're really talking about millions of dollars being available, as opposed to really, struggling to try to raise little bits and pieces like we normally do when we're just kind of looking within arts and arts fundraising. So I think it's obviously a conversation that we're pushing forward and trying to figure out, and we're talking to all of those different areas to try to figure out how some more funding can come together for folks. And I've seen this comment in the chats, and of course we've been having these conversations throughout, and I think as we get closer to the end of the fiscal year in June, people having a really hard time saying, how can I can't plan for fall or for later in the summer. How can I even be here to take advantage of whatever the new phases are? how am I going to sustain this to still be here to try to reimagine what I'm doing, or take advantage of outdoor performances or whatever it is. And it's a really challenging question, and we don't have a complete answer to that right now. But I think that there is also, and Emily, I don't know if you want to speak on this from a state kind of funding source or federal funding perspective, but this is also why it is really important to target what, as Emily mentioned, Congress, like being vocal. I don't think if we look locally just for our own kind of arts funding, we're going to see enough funding to really make a difference in this area. So how are we going to show up in the larger stimulus and support conversation?
Thank you.
I would just add that one of the places that MassCreative and our partners across the country, as state arts advocacy groups, are looking at is those additional pots of money. So, for example, some cities in Massachusetts who receive community block grants use that for creative economic development. Lynn is a good example of that. So we know that there are more dollars being channeled in community block grants right now. That was part of the CARES Act. How do we encourage local municipal leaders to think about creative economic development as a qualified use of those dollars? So, I think the other piece of this is that we know we matter to our neighborhoods, to our communities, to our audiences, and to every region of the Commonwealth. And we know that from an economic perspective, we know that from a health and wellness perspective, from a connectivity perspective. And we are trying to share, and we encourage and urge you to share all of those ways with our decision makers. Yes, they are having to make a lot of decisions. And yes, every single sector in Massachusetts is hurting right now. We are not alone in that. So we are also being really thoughtful and strategic about how we are asking for money and the timing of that. That doesn't mean that MassCreative is going to stop encouraging and advocating elected leaders and decision makers to include the arts community and the cultural community in spending priorities. That's in fact the bulk of our work. But this is another point where we can remind our decision makers just how much value we bring to our communities and our neighborhoods. I wanted to, if it's okay, just address Erica's question. So Erica Schwartz asks, are there any updates on processing timelines for unemployment and work share? So can I ask Erica, is this from the perspective of an employer or as an employee?
Employees, I think personally I can say I know that some of our members who are on furlough the wait turnaround time was over 4 weeks. I know for work share, for example, our application is still pending review status. So I just didn't know if we knew that there was any specific lag. And I'm thinking more for folks on here that are able to take advantage of the PPP, but that is going to run out after the 8 weeks. And if they are then going to have to turn to unemployment, just if we had any kind of understanding about where the turnaround is right now, if it's improving, and then how we're looking forward, and if there was some advocacy in general. I know it's certainly not unique to our sector, but it's certainly something that I think I've seen a lot of comments in the chat about. Our sector is going to be one of the last to open, so this is going to be more of a draw that could impact us down the line as well.
Thanks, Erica. That's a really good point. Yeah. So I read, before I got on this call, I read the news that the unemployment rate in Massachusetts is it's the highest it's ever been in 44 years. So I think there is a piece of this, which is like the filings are happening so quickly. And I think they're processing as quickly as they can. There does need to be some advocacy around that. And I will follow up around unemployment filing wait times. I know that there's also some sincere issues having to do with individuals who qualify both as W-2 workers and 1099 workers, and how the system between regular unemployment and pandemic unemployment assistance is not set up to talk to each other correctly, and folks are getting either kicked out or getting a lot less than they should be. So that's another place where we are working to stand up some advocacy. If you if you are an individual or an employer, so I want to give a shout out, as I've done a couple of weeks in the past. The Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts have provided unbelievable technical assistance to individuals who are struggling to navigate unemployment, particularly pandemic unemployment assistance. So that is a continued resource, and I would encourage you, if you're having trouble, to go to them. The nice thing is that they often share with MassCreative what are the top obstacles, and that helps us in our advocacy work. And when we're talking to decision makers around, here are the things that would really help. On the flip side, if you are an employer who is dealing with having to repay unemployment, please let me know if you've gotten any communication from the Department of Unemployment Assistance around that. We're looking for specific examples of where you've gotten communication that's telling you you have to pay it back 100% as opposed to the 50%, and any of the timelines that they are stating that are attached to that bill that you might be getting. So I'm going to put my email in the chat. That's like some real just specific asks that help us build the case, and that a lot of this work right now is about case making. Leah says, who do we contact about individuals for unemployment re 1099s and W-2s? So I would direct you to the Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts. I'll try to put a link to their website in the chat. Oh, Julia beat me to it. They are really phenomenal in terms of providing technical assistance and really usable practical tools. So, and I'm putting my email in the chat now too.
Great, thanks, Emily. And we're a little over the hour now, so I think in general we're going to try to keep this to an hour just to be respectful of everybody's time on a Friday afternoon, particularly this Friday on an 80-degree day before what is a long weekend for many people. But I want to thank you all for continuing to be in this with us, and for staying strong through a lot of uncertainty and questions. Please send us again just your questions through the MassCreative form or directly to us. And I think there was one last question here about BCC grants in the fall. We're moving forward as if that is unchanged. If that does change, we will find a way to fill that. That's not something that I personally am really willing to backslide on, is the small amount that we already do in grant making to arts organizations. So I feel like, even if some funding scenario changed, we would find a way to make that happen. Okay, so I think that is it. Thank you so much, everybody. We will be in touch. Have a good weekend. Go outside. It's good to see you all. And thanks again, Emily and Pascal and Christina and everybody who continues to make this happen on Fridays.